Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name is David Halpern, the CEO of Israel Policy Forum. We're speaking on Thursday afternoon after what has felt yet again to be a week that feels like a year. We're, of course, speaking after a dizzying number of developments over the last several days in Washington, in the region, and across the world, with the first American Pope, Leo the 14th, being announced just a few moments ago. It seems like a very long time ago, but the week started with escalating Israeli strikes in Damascus. The week continued with reports that Israel and Syria are having indirect talks through the United Arab Emirates. The week began with the Houthi rocket attacks from Yemen that targeted Israel's Ben Gurion airport. The week continued with a deal struck between the United States and the Houthis on a ceasefire that did not, by all indications, include the Israelis. And of course, the week included reports of a significant buildup of the IDF intending to go back into Gaza for a significant series of operations and perhaps to stay in a holding pattern for the long haul, but only after President Trump's visit to the region next week. And of course, we are hearing a number of developments about concerns in the humanitarian situation in Gaza, as well as reports of new American mechanisms to address that situation. The reports have been fast, furious, and dizzying. If you're joining us today, I hope you are continuing to utilize Israel Policy Forum as a resource to help track and to make sense of all of the developments happening in the region. You should be subscribed to our weekly Koplau column that is distributed every Thursday morning, and this Thursday's column is certainly worth checking out. This week on Israel Policy Pod, our podcast, we'll have a discussion with expert Michael Milstein, one of our frequent guests, and Israeli expert on the Palestinian arena, to discuss the plans for this IDF operation in Gaza. You can check that out wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, today we're going to be talking not about this week, but about next week. My guest has the incredibly difficult task of predicting what will actually happen next week. But we really are thrilled to have with us Ambassador Michael Ratney. Ambassador Ratney, of course, served as U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the previous Biden administration, but he really has an incredibly accomplished Foreign Service career before serving as ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He, of course, has served across the Middle East, notably in the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. He has been a special envoy for Syria during the first Trump administration, and of course served as U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem, the primary contact and the United States relationship with the Palestinians. And of course, most recently, in his role as ambassador to Saudi Arabia, had a front row seat to the efforts of the Biden administration to forge a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, someone who is highly sought after for his thoughts on President Trump's first official visit, a global visit, which will be to the Gulf next week, with scheduled stops in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. We're going to jump into a conversation today, but I want to encourage all of you to be part of the conversation. You can ask a question by typing a question using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will not have a formal Q&A session. I invite questions from the very start. I'll ask my own, but I'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. So let's jump right in. First of all, Ambassador Ratney, thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Thanks for the invitation, David.
I wonder if you could start by just telling us, what does Trump hope to achieve? Why is he going on this trip?
Good. That's a better question than asking me about the election of the Pope, which I didn't have any expertise for you.
Maybe my second question, but okay.
Like something. So I think for President Trump, I think the selection of these three countries is extremely important because I think it increases the likelihood of kind of presenting to the world the impression of a big, successful visit. It'll be a visit in which he's received graciously. He can announce business deals. I think the U.S. business participation is a big part of it, and I think they want to have some announcements to make with respect to trade and investment. It won't be marred by public protests. And I think it's an opportunity just for him to point to a part of the world that's extremely dynamic, important to us, and he's being received well there. So it's not counting his trip for the former Pope's funeral. This really is his first big international trip. And I think just giving a big public impression of success, I think is job number one. I think the commercial piece of it really is for him, for the White House, the centerpiece of it. We're enmeshed now in this sort of global controversy surrounding tariffs, and I think they really would like to point to some kind of positive agenda on the economic front. So trade with the Gulf, investment from the Gulf into the United States. I think dominating the trade and investment conversation is going to be two big pieces. One will be about tech and artificial intelligence in particular. And I'm sure they're working very hard right now on finalizing something that can announce with respect to kind of reliable and predictable exports of advanced tech and advanced chips to fuel the artificial intelligence industry that's growing in the Gulf. And defense sales is the other big piece. This is where U.S. companies have traditionally been the partner of choice for all of our Gulf partners, but all of them, I think, have shared a frustration with the speed and the difficulty and sometimes the political baggage attached with defense exports. So I think if there's big announcements to make in defense and in tech, I think it'll be deemed a success, but I expect they'll be talking about other issues as well.
Mhm. The latest reports today are about the United States pursuing a civilian nuclear agreement with Saudi Arabia, something that traditionally was viewed as part of the overall package to getting Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel. I'm curious what you have heard about these reports. What do you make of the idea of the United States working with Saudi Arabia on a civilian nuclear program agreement?
So the U.S. Secretary of Energy visited Saudi Arabia a couple of weeks ago, in some sense, I think, to advance this big state visit. And the idea of U.S.-Saudi civil nuclear cooperation has been on the agenda really since the start, maybe 2 years ago or so, of our serious discussions about normalization. As you point out, David, that was often uh, thought to be kind of subsumed into that as part of an economic pillar of a normalization agreement. The substance of it, I would say, was never fully finalized, but the expectation was that it would include some measure of support for Saudi's what they hope to be a nuclear energy industry. And the way I always thought about it is the Saudis have uranium deposits in their country, and they have ambitions to become dependent on renewable energy, including nuclear, and they would like their own nuclear power plants, and they would like everything in between. Obviously, it's the everything in between that's the complicated part because that suggests an enrichment capability. An enrichment capability is complicated. It's politically fraught. It has proliferation concerns, and it's enormously expensive. Whether we ever get to that point where the nature of U.S. civil nuclear cooperation with Saudi or any other country involves actual enrichment of uranium, I don't know. It seems improbable to me, but it also seems as though it's something that the Saudis, for reasons of kind of their desire to be self-sufficient in energy production and continuing to export energy even in a post-fossil fuel era, might want to support. I think there may well be some kind of an announcement about civil nuclear cooperation. I don't know that we'll see much detail about that, and I expect it'll be in some sense an ability to say that we're talking about it, we're consulting about it, but I don't think we'll see much substance on it for a while.
What you haven't mentioned, of course, as being a key to this visit is, of course, the effort to pursue Israel-Saudi normalization. But even this week, I think we've heard President Trump and others talk about how they expect a Saudi-Israel deal would happen quickly, or rather quickly, I think is what we have heard from various officials. I wonder if you could take us back to your experience in the Israel-Saudi dialogue. We heard so many reports that prior to October 7, Israel and Saudi Arabia were reaching or close to reaching a deal. You obviously had a seat in those rooms. I wonder if you could take us back to where we were and where we are today with regard to Israel-Saudi normalization.
Sure. The discussion of normalization in all of its various elements really goes back a little more than 2 years, a bit before I got there as ambassador. By the time I got there in April of 23, those discussions were starting to become much, much more detailed and based around four basic elements. One was a treaty, a mutual defense treaty, something we haven't done in 50 or 60 years, along the lines of what we have with Japan or Korea. The second is a defense cooperation agreement, which would cover the nuts and bolts of our military cooperation, including things like defense sales. The third would be an economic component, which could have included something on nuclear cooperation, but also possibly other economic elements as well, perhaps artificial intelligence, trade, things like that. And then finally, a piece involving the Palestinians. Now, the way I always thought about it is the first three pillars of that were essentially things that the U.S. and Saudi were doing for each other. The fourth, the Palestinian element, were things that Israel was expected to do for the Palestinians. And discussion of that really only got started in earnest, I think, right before October 7th. In fact, Secretary Blinken came to Saudi Arabia on October 15th, essentially with the intention of having a more detailed conversation with the Saudis about that. But only a week earlier, the October 7th attack had happened, and that ended up dominating the conversation. I will say, despite some press reports around that time that because of October 7th and the war that followed, that the idea of normalization was off the table, it really wasn't. I think the basic logic of a normalization deal uh, was always there. And I think certainly from the Saudi perspective and our perspective, it was something we wanted to pursue. And the discussions, always fairly quiet in any event, had continued. By the time we got to summer or fall of last year, most of the elements between the United States and Saudi Arabia were pretty close to completion. But the Israel-Palestinian piece was still pending. And it was getting more complicated because the war was grinding on and it was becoming much, much more difficult for Saudi Arabia to go into something that would be, in any event, highly controversial. Controversial domestically, controversial regionally. And for that to happen, it was pretty clear what the Saudis would need in order to move ahead with normalization. And this is no great secret insight. These are things that the Saudis themselves said publicly. They needed an end to the war, and they needed a path to statehood for the Palestinians. Now, both of those elements, I think, merit a little bit of elaboration because I think both, in some sense, are subject to misunderstanding or disagreement. What does an end to the war mean? I suspect for the Saudis, it means an end to any aerial bombardment and an end to any IDF presence inside of Gaza. So that's not where we are now. Obviously, things seem poised to get worse, maybe much worse. But essentially, that's an end to the war. A path to statehood, I think sometimes because the Saudis' own terminology changed from time to time, people weren't quite sure where the Saudis stood on that. My sense is what they needed was, and still need really, is a clear public commitment by the Israeli government and Israeli government that pursuit of a two-state solution is their policy. Now, both those things are pretty hard. The end to the Gaza war is hard for reasons that I think the Israelis themselves are in the best position to answer. A path to statehood is hard because it has become kind of an article, almost an ideological faith that preventing statehood for the Palestinians is what Prime Minister Netanyahu stands for. And certainly the sense is that this current coalition would fall if he articulated support for a two-state solution at this point. So both are really hard, but I think both are where the Saudis, shall we say, price is for moving ahead with normalization. I would only add, David, that I think if we got past those two basic requirements, there would be a negotiation about other elements for the Palestinians, perhaps things that aren't quite as controversial, economic measures to revitalize the Palestinian economy, things that could reform or revitalize the Palestinian Authority, uh, from economic, political, security perspective, things that really been on lists of measures that would help bolster the Palestinians' prospects. And we've had these sorts of lists for years. But I think we never got to an agreement on any of those elements because the two basic issues were left unresolved as we got to the end of the Biden administration. Now we're in a new administration, and I think President Trump has a lot of enthusiasm for Israel-Saudi normalization, but my sense is he will face the same he will have the same sorts of conversations when he gets to Riyadh that we had
Right.
when I was last there, which is this has gotten too difficult. The war has ground on for too long, and for the Saudis to move ahead with this, they really have a basic price that needs to be paid.
That's interesting because I'm sure you've heard the analysis, or I guess you'd call it criticism, that was that the Biden administration was actually the actor that was pushing on the Palestinian file. That the Saudis don't actually care all that much about the Palestinians. If it wasn't for the Biden administration, this actually wouldn't be a red line. I wonder if you could comment on that because it seems you're suggesting that's certainly not the case.
I heard two kinds of criticism that were sort of two sides of the same coin. One is what you said, which is that the Biden administration was going to introduce elements of support for the Palestinians that the Saudis themselves didn't even want, thereby complicating a deal that otherwise could be struck. The other criticism was that the Biden administration was so enthusiastic for a normalization deal, they were going to walk away from any requirements for the Palestinians because, in this telling, the Saudis themselves didn't care about it, and so we weren't going to care about it. You can imagine two slightly different constituencies would offer those criticisms. I never thought either was accurate, to be honest. I think there was going to be some element for the Palestinians all along. It was always the assumption for a lot of reasons. The Saudis had their own reasons, and it may well be that the Saudis may have strong views about the Palestinians or the Palestinian leadership or the PA, but the fact of the matter is they understand they have constituencies, both domestic and regional and international, that care about this. And I think the Saudi leadership doesn't want to be tarred as traitors to that. That brings real risks. And so the Saudis always had their reasons. We always had their reasons. I mean, the Biden administration also felt like this was part of the Biden administration's policy, is taking steps that would keep a path open to a two-state solution. And I think there was the political reality, the sense that if there wasn't some strong set of measures for the Palestinians, it would be even more difficult to get Senate ratification of the whole agreement. Don't forget, because this involves a treaty, it has to go to the Senate. You need 67 votes. I think once upon a time, you sent something to the Senate that was good for Israel, and it was pretty easy to get it passed. Now we have a much more fractious political situation. And I think there has to be something, it has to be good for Israel, it has to be good for the Palestinians, it has to be good for us. And by the way, it has to be good for the Saudis. Now, I would say, as difficult as the situation is right now, I think if we still ever get to that point where there's a deal on the table that's good for us, that's good for the Israelis, that's good for the Palestinians, and good for the Saudis, I think it would stand a good chance of ratification in the Senate. But unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Mm. And so Israel-Saudi normalization doesn't appear on the agenda, or it doesn't seem that it will be next week. And I wonder to the extent that Gaza will be on the agenda at all. Um, and I'm curious, in your experience, of course, prior to the Trump administration and what you're seeing now, to what extent are the Saudis prepared to be a part of an investment, reconstruction, rehabilitation, interim administration? To what extent are the Saudis actually prepared to play a proactive role if the Israelis, of course, are interested? Do you see a willingness there to enhance their engagement vis-a-vis the Palestinian, the next chapter of the situation in Gaza?
I definitely think Gaza will be part of the agenda. I mean, don't forget, in a visit like this, there's going to be, and this is normal for any visit, there's going to be a lot of effort to kind of publicly show the positive agenda and the success. And I think that's where the sort of the commercial dimension comes in. But the private meetings are going to talk about a lot of things. Some we're more interested in talking about than others. And I think the Saudis and the Saudis will almost certainly raise what's happening in Gaza, kind of both from just a basic humanitarian perspective, but also because they're really concerned about the effect of this war. The Saudis are at a point where their whole goal is just to de-escalate conflict in the region because conflict dissuades investment, it dissuades tourists, it stokes radicalization among youth. It's a losing proposition. And for them, even though they understand the solutions to these conflicts might be elusive and certainly imperfect, they just want to de-escalate them. And so I think the U.S. delegation will be reminded that Gaza is all of that. It's a humanitarian catastrophe, but it also is, not to sound glib, it's bad for business. It dissuades people from looking at the Middle East as a palatable place to do business. It stokes radicalization in a way that puts pressure on governments throughout the region, and they just want it to end. Your other question, will they be a part of a solution, of a path forward? I hope so. I would say early on, just after October 7th, there was enough kind of narrative in the media that whatever happened, uh, don't worry, the Saudis and the Emiratis will rebuild everything. And I think that kind of unnerved them because here's a war that they had nothing to do with. Um, and that they were being told that they were going to have to bear the consequences of, at least financially, at a time when I know the Saudis best at this point, they're very inward looking. They want to build, even rebuild parts of their own country and their own economy, especially now at a time when oil prices are softer. The idea of being saddled with responsibility for a conflict that they really had nothing to do with was not particularly enticing. I always thought, and I still think, that if we get to the point of a ceasefire, and a hostage deal and an end to this conflict and some kind of a coherent international effort that involves us and the Europeans and the Arabs, that will take on this issue of the next phase of Gaza, humanitarian aid, reconstruction, rehabilitation of governance there. I think they would be a part of it. I just don't think they want to own it.
Yeah. So I want to remind the audience to ask a question. Just use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type the question, and I will get to as many as I possibly can. And I want to start with one anonymous attendee who wrote that Trump has said that there's going to be a big announcement before he leaves for his big trip. It's unclear what it will be. Do you have any insight on what it might be? And is it Gaza related? And is it the name change of the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Gulf? I guess I'll add that.
So somebody sent me a tweet that he was going to have a big announcement, and I thought that probably means there's not going to be a big announcement. And then they said, "Oh, it's just calling the Persian Gulf the Arabian Gulf."
Yeah.
Is that it? I don't know. Uh, when you're a diplomat, you assiduously choose which term you use depending upon your audience. Although we've come around to the view that all we call it is the Gulf, and everyone knows what you're talking about. If we decided officially we would call it the Arabian Gulf, I don't think anybody in the Arab world would complain.
We have another question from our friend Dan Rotem in Israel, who writes, the word in Israel has been that behind closed doors, the Saudis have been and likely still are eager for an Israeli strike on Iran. Is that true or false?
So I honestly think what the Saudis want is de-escalation. So if there was something that led to an end to this Iranian regime definitively, it would be hard for a lot of folks in the region not to be enthusiastic about that. But I think the Saudi fear is that somebody, Israel, us, whatever, strikes Iran in a way that we sort of put a stick in that hornet's nest, and the reaction is something that Saudi Arabia bears the brunt of, or the Emirates or Qatar bear the brunt of. So I think any sort of a strike that's short of definitive is just gonna stoke conflict in a way that's going to end badly for everybody, at least in the near term. So I think it's an interesting point we're at right now because on the one hand you have President Trump and the Saudis in a way share a view on this, which is that they're both averse to military conflict with Iran right now. Uh, in a way, in some sense, for the same reason, it's bad for business, right? Uh, I think beyond that, it gets much, much more complicated, obviously, because this Israeli government seems to be putting forth a view that now is the time of maximum weakness by the Iranians. Now is the time to strike at least their nuclear facilities. And so there's pressure from Israel and from a lot of people of kind of like mind with the Israeli government in that direction. Um, I think from others in the region, probably including Israel, to be honest, there's concern that, okay, diplomacy is good, it's de-escalatory, but what's the substance of that diplomacy? What would we be agreeing to or conceding to the Iranians in the course of that diplomacy in order to buy the de-escalation? I think a lot of folks in the region would be concerned if those negotiations result in sort of an implicit support or agreement to some level of enrichment by the Iranians. It would be problematic. And then the details of it, the substance of it, some of the comments by U.S. very, very senior U.S. officials have fluctuated about just what is our goal, what is our bottom line for all of this, and it's changed. And I think recently the president himself said, like, we haven't decided that yet. So it creates a certain amount of uncertainty. Diplomacy, good, de-escalatory, but what's the substance of that? Are we just setting ourselves up for some kind of a failure down the road that will kind of force our hand in a military sense at a moment where we might not have the same advantages we have right now?
Yeah, and I wonder if you could comment a bit on Saudi-Iran relations today. I know there was this sort of warming, I believe, during your tenure as ambassador. Um, and if you could say a word about how Saudi Arabia has been balancing the obvious regional competition with its diplomatic outreach.
Yeah, while I was there, they reestablished their diplomatic relations with Iran. It had been suspended probably 6 or 7 years earlier after Saudi consulate was stormed in Iran. Um, and I think their decision to go ahead with reestablishing their relationship was mostly, it wasn't born of any kind of change in their view of the Iranian regime or their ideology or any great optimism that that would change anytime soon. I think it was just born of the same general approach to de-escalation that's guided a lot of their regional policy right now. They can't fix it, they just want to de-escalate it.
Mm.
So they pay not much of a price to reestablish embassies in Tehran and Riyadh. And if it yields some measure, I think of it as an imperfect tool in a toolbox filled with imperfect tools, in which their main goal is just to keep conflict at a minimum so that they can focus on what they're really trying to do, which is transform their economy and their society. Uh, so obviously, it's proven to be an imperfect tool because I don't have any sense that Iranian support for the proxies, including the Houthis that have long been antagonistic to the Saudis, has ebbed. Um, but nonetheless, I just think of it as I said a moment ago, an imperfect tool pulled out of a toolbox filled with imperfect tools.
Great. Well, I'll ask the audience to keep the questions coming. There's some really good ones and some really complicated ones. I want to start with two questions actually from Leslie Thompson. Um, One regarding the situation in Syria and Saudi's interests in Syria, and one regarding the issue of AI potentially falling into the hands of China. She asked, Ambassador, do you think the Saudis will advocate for the U.S. to lift certain sanctions or provide additional relief for Syria, presumably the new Syrian regime? Her second question being, if there is a major tech AI deal where the United States is exporting more advanced chips, do you think the Saudis and possibly the UAE are willing and capable of preventing them from falling into the hands of China? Two
Yeah,
very different questions, but
two
good
very
ones.
different questions. Basically, yes to both, but you probably want more than that, right?
If
Um,
you could.
so on Syria, uh, I think for sure the Saudis are going to want an easing of sanctions. They've said that publicly. Their approach, their view is what we have now in Damascus is not perfect. They're not enamored of political movements that have their roots in the Muslim Brotherhood or worse, as is the case with HTS. Um, but it's better than where we were. it's better than where we feared it would end up or could end up. And the best path forward is just letting the Syrian economy breathe. And honestly, this is kind of my view as well. If there are if there's bad behavior, if they're moving in a direction that's not great, we always have the option of reimposing sanctions. But right now, every analysis that I've read has suggested that the real impediment to a lot of the changes we want to see in Syria are just crippled by the continued imposition of sanctions. Even though there's a general license that allows certain kinds of economic activities, it so dissuades um, companies and organizations from getting involved in Syria because they're worried about legal exposure, that even if they theoretically could get involved, they don't. And so I think we, the US side, will hear from our interlocutors that you need to let the Syrian economy breathe. And that's our best shot at having leverage to influence their behavior in all of the things that we want them to do, including fighting terrorism and getting control of the drug trade and treating minorities well, and all of those issues that we've publicly asked for. I think our best shot at that, and I think this is the Saudi view, the best shot at that is if the economy is in a better shape. So I think they will hear from that. I don't know where we are in that. It sounds like it's a fairly complicated, as it would be in any administration, kind of a kind of a complicated conversation internally, because I bet there's a variety of views being put forward about that. Um, to be honest, in the context of an administration that doesn't really want to get involved in Syria at all, so that may cut both ways.
Yeah, but there is, of course, the challenge of Israel and the competition with Turkey and Syria and Trump, describing Erdogan as someone he's very close with, and that broader dynamic. I'm curious what you make of how the United States engages with the region vis-a-vis the United Arab Emirates in these talks and the like as well.
Yeah, we have important relations with both Turkey and Israel, right? It's complicated, and now they're both getting involved in Syria in ways that are antithetical to one another.
Yeah,
Uh, we have concerns about Turkish ambitions there. The Turks have been extraordinarily, like their public rhetoric from Erdogan about Israel has been really belligerent. And I'm
yeah,
sure the Israelis see that, and they wonder whether kind of further cementing a Turkish presence or Turkish support for a government that's kind of rooted in jihadi political movements. They may say maybe it's better that they just be chaos in Syria rather than have this kind of HTS government with Turkish support being cemented. So the Israelis are continuing to undertake military operations in Syria. The Turks are continuing to kind of at least signal that they want to cement their presence there. And they're fundamentally at odds with one another. Um, I if Trump can fix this, more power to him, right? He does have a decent relationship with Erdogan, but some of these motivations for the Turks are bigger than that. So I
yeah.
worry a bit about that. To be honest, I worry because I look back and I worked on Syria at the height of the war. And one of the reasons Syrians suffered so badly is because foreign powers were so heavily involved, supporting and arming and funding their movements. Some we would consider the good guys, some were very clearly the bad guys. But I really worry about the possibility that as we've gotten past this point of, Assad's now gone, something that a lot of people have given up hope on. He's gone. The worst thing that could happen is if you have a resurgence of a war based on foreign powers getting involved again. Um, in some sense, maybe that's maybe that's consistent with the way Trump thinks, which is it's not our war. We should be out of it. But if we're out of it, pretty much everyone ought to be out of it too.
I want to go
Uh,
back to my previous question about China and the advanced chips falling into the hands of China, and curious just generally how you view Saudi Arabia and its relationship with the United States, balancing its relationship with China and how that's evolved over time.
So we have in both Saudi Arabia and the Emirates two countries that have enormous ambitions in artificial intelligence, and both have similar comparative advantages in artificial intelligence, right? Large swaths of low-cost land, cheap energy, and investable capital to fuel uh, data centers and other applications of artificial intelligence at scale in ways that's hard to do elsewhere in the world. They know they have these advantages, and they feel like they're a natural partner. And big U.S. tech companies, whether the chip producers themselves or companies like Google or Amazon Web Services and others that want to build big data centers also know it. So this has been just probably it'll be topic number one, I think, on this trip in both of those countries. Um, I came around to the view, and there was a very fractious discussion about it in the last administration, whole range of views about how we should handle this. At one extreme, it was just export everything freely. At another extreme, it was we shouldn't export the crown jewels lest they get into the wrong hands. Um, I came around to the view that if we're too cautious about our exports, uh, then we're going to drive the innovation in China that we're trying to compete against.
Hmm.
Right? So, on the other hand, if we have partners who are prepared to work with us to impose export controls, and
Hmm.
those countries have said that they're willing to work with us, are they perfect? I don't know. But here we have countries that we've worked with for decades on a whole variety of including tech issues, who want to work with us, who say they're prepared to work with us on export controls, and they're cognizant of our concerns about competition with China. Better to work with them than to just withhold our technology, and they're going to look elsewhere. Like those ambitions will be realized. They have the desire, they have the capital, and I will tell you, when I got to Saudi Arabia, I never heard about artificial intelligence. By the time I left, it was topic number one with every single visitor to that country.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. A sign of the times. It makes a lot of sense. We're jumping around all over the region, and I appreciate you're taking the rapid fire. Next question is from Farah Badur, our friend in Jordan, who writes, "Do you think the Saudis would be satisfied with an agreement similar to the Comprehensive Security Integration and Prosperity Agreement signed between Bahrain and the United States?" And perhaps you can give us some background because I'm not sure everyone is as familiar as Farah on this agreement.
I mean, so there's a whole range of different kinds of military agreements with long names that become acronyms. We signed one with Bahrain that was short of a treaty. It was, as we say, bigger than a bread basket, smaller than the Empire State Building, but nonetheless uh, sent a message to others in the region that the United States, in this case Bahrain, were partners in some special way. Um, the Saudis all along wanted a very particular kind of partnership, which is a treaty alliance. They don't want something that's subject to the vagaries of politics of a particular administration. They want it to endure, and they want clarity. And if you're making these kind of multi-billion-dollar investments in your future, you want clarity. You want to know if things go bad, and by that it means if things go bad with Iran, particularly, what is the United States going to do? By the way, we also want to know what Saudi Arabia is going to do. So it's a two-way street. Um, so there's value in that. I think the sense we had was you're not going to get there without Senate ratification, and Senate ratification requires a package that's desirable for everybody. Remember, the second pillar of our discussions about normalization involved a defense cooperation agreement. So that's not a mutual defense treaty. That's an agreement on the kind of nuts and bolts of our military cooperation and defense sales. Now, that's something that theoretically wouldn't require Senate ratification. There's going to be a lot of political views about it, to be sure, but in theory, it could go ahead without the overall package of normalization. Um, that may be something, and I don't have insights into this with the Trump administration. It might be something that they would consider, depending upon how realistic they thought the prospects of an overall normalization agreement would be. And there's merit in it. There's value in it for us. There's value in it for the Saudis, um, and it would be more, I think, probably more significant in a way than some of the other agreements we've signed that are short of treaties.
You could turn to what I believe will be the second part of Trump's visit, which is to Qatar. We have a number of questions about the U.S. Relationship with Qatar, obviously its role in the hostage negotiations. I'm curious, we have one question on simply, how to view Qatar friend problem, is leaning on Qatar a solution for the hostage negotiations. Um, and secondly, is Qatar part of the solution for a post-Gaza? Is another question that we received from an anonymous attendee, given that it is announcing billion-dollar investments just about everywhere, and comment on the pros and obvious challenges with that as well.
God, I mean, I worked there 15 years ago. I remember it was the height of our military operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and the same conversations were going on. Here's this country that, on the one hand, um, funded Al Jazeera, which had, highly, coverage that was highly antagonistic to everything that we were doing in the Middle East.
Yep.
They hosted Hamas even then and other ne'er-do-wells from the region. And every time people would get in Washington would get irritated with them, they'd be reminded that, oh yeah, they also host the largest air base for U.S. forces in the region for free. And so this are they our friend or are they our foe conversation has been going on for a long, long time. A lot of it has centered around the fact that they host Hamas and have maintained this channel of dialogue with Hamas, which after October 7th, the discussions about it became particularly neurotic because on the one hand, it was Hamas that started the war on October 7th. And here's a partner of ours, an important partner in the region of ours, who's actually hosting these folks, sort of giving them some degree of credibility and legitimacy by doing so. On the other hand, absent their channel, where would we be? So they were both viewed by some as the problem and some as the solution, and others as both at the same time. And I think it's a really devilishly complicated issue to solve. I think the Qataris offer a tremendous amount to the United States. They are important partners with us. I think they might, and I haven't been there in a while, but they might argue that, you take the good with the bad. The Qataris, need to live in that part of the world forever, and they're going to make their calculations about what kind of relationships they maintain with Hamas, with Iran, with others. But at the same time, they're going to make clear that the U.S. has military access that's basically unparalleled anywhere else in the region. Uh, so at the end of the day, I think we do have to take the good with the bad because sometimes we understand that we might need that bad at a really tough moment. And I think these negotiations with over the hostages and the ceasefire in Gaza is a great example of that.
Um, there are quite a bit of questions about Gaza. Um, and I think the right way to frame this in a way that I think would be helpful for you to comment is, you know, what is if Israel does sort of permanently control Gaza in some form of long-term, essentially permanent occupation, potentially return to settlements there. Do the Saudis care? Is this now Israel's problem? I mean, certainly rhetorically concerned about the Palestinian cause, but does it shake the region if the Israelis are sort of do not have a plan to leave?
Yeah, potentially for sure. And it depends how gruesome it gets. And it depends how politically volatile it gets. I've actually been struck over the past few years the degree to which um, things that were once kind of unimaginable have transpired, and the rest of the region kind of doesn't want it to define their relationships with us, or in some cases with Israel. So there's this desire to insulate all of the difficulties and violence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from other sets of relationships. In the past, that was inconceivable. Even small kind of blowups ended up resulting in ruptures of relationships or at a minimum kind of complications of initiatives that we were trying to undertake. And now it seems much more insulated. So the question is, at what point is it no longer insulated? And I wish I could answer that. You look at the United Arab Emirates, for example, they seem absolutely determined to insulate their relationship with Israel from everything that's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But the United Arab Emirates is a different sort of society than, say, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is much larger domestic population. Uh, and I think the Saudis would look at what goes on in Gaza through the lens of, is this is this stoking radicalization of our own population? In which case, we got to find a way to end this. Um,
We have questions about Egypt as well, which I imagine that's the same question.
yeah, and honestly, I think both Egypt and Jordan look at what's going on through much more existential lens. You know, the potential of mass population movements as a result of Israel military activities or even expulsions and extremists. And some of the talk that's been in the past just unspeakable is now kind of part of mainstream discourse. If that happens, I think both Egypt and Jordan look at it in much, much graver terms. And I think at that point, countries, even in the Gulf, that want to maintain a certain amount of distance, definitely don't want to see destabilization in Jordan or Egypt. It's just, it would be potentially catastrophic. It would lead to rise of much more militant Muslim Brotherhood affiliated groups throughout the region. And the degree or the way in which they might want to step in, I can't predict, but I think it could unnerve them.
Yeah. Um, just a time for a few more, but I wanted there was a question about Saudi Arabia's economic future. What's its post-oil future as it's described? I know there, wonder if you could describe this 2030 vision. To what extent is that at the foremost of Saudi concerns? Where is Saudi Arabia today in terms of the evolution of its economy, its society, writ large, in this sort of generational change to MBS and all of these grand designs of new cities and technology and the like. What do you make of the Saudi goals economically going forward?
So for the Saudis, the transformation under Vision 2030 is everything. And I remember the sort of tension when we would have officials come through who would all want to talk to their Saudi counterparts about Sudan or Gaza or Yemen or Iran, all of the bad stuff that's happening in the region. And our Saudi counterparts would all want to talk about the good stuff that's happening inside the country. And of course, all that good stuff, part of it's dependent on keeping the bad stuff away. It's also, by the way, dependent on oil prices being higher than they are. So those are the two risks that I think Saudi faces when they think about achieving these huge ambitions. How do you keep the money coming in to pay for it? They want a post-oil future, but you got to pay for that with oil revenues. And how do you keep away the conflicts that are going to dissuade investors and tourists, business people, and so forth from coming? Um, I would tell anybody that tell any of these folks and anybody that visits Saudi, do not underestimate their determination to see it through. They don't know when the age of fossil fuel is going to end, but they are determined that they have a viable and prosperous economy when that happens. Now, that's much easier said than done. Here's a country that, although the percentage of GDP from non-oil related sources is increasing, and that's all to the good, it's very difficult to achieve a transformation of a country that had been so totally dependent on energy revenues to one that they could imagine a future in which it's not. But sometimes I think they don't get the credit they deserve. They're obviously one of the largest oil producers in the world, but they're also one of the largest investors in renewable energy globally, in solar and wind. Ultimately, they want to invest in nuclear energy as well. They're producers of green hydrogen. Green hydrogen at this point doesn't really have, because it's so expensive, it's having trouble finding a market. But nonetheless, they're determined because they see this as a future energy source that can help wean them away from oil or give them a lifeline when oil is no longer used to the degree it is now globally. So almost everything you see Saudi do domestically is built around that. So developing industries that are viable in a post-fossil fuel environment, developing the human capital of their population so that they're not dependent entirely on foreign workers to staff these operations, looking at investments that they can make with their public investment fund that both kind of help transform their own society, but also give them stakes in companies that are going to be a part of their future in mining and minerals, for example, in electric vehicles, in a whole range of areas that they see as viable off into the future. And sometimes people will look at some of the investments that they make and think they don't really seem to make sense. But I think sometimes they only make sense if you look at them through a very long-term lens. These aren't things that they're trying to see a turnaround in a year. They're looking a decade or more down the road to have a viable manufacturing defense industrial base, for example, for the point where they really need it.
And sort of underscores your point about the Saudi orientation that is it good for business, the mindset that you've described a number of times in this
Yeah.
in this session. What did you make of the announcement of the U.S. Houthi ceasefire deal and how we got to that point?
I'm gonna watch and wait, I think. I am constantly dubious about what the Houthis say. Uh, I think certainly if there's an end to strikes on commercial shipping and efforts to strike U.S. naval vessels, that's all for the good. But if they continue to target Israel, then whatever it is, it's not de-escalatory because the Israelis are going to retaliate. So it may well be that the Houthis are trying to somehow distinguish. Maybe the Americans won't strike us if we stop striking commercial shipping. But I have a feeling that it doesn't really solve the problem. I have to say, I was among those voices advocating for a more muscular approach to the Houthis because I was there through that whole period when their strikes first on Israel, and then initially at least they were having trouble striking Israel, so they turned their attention to commercial shipping. Um, and it became intolerable. It was having a huge impact on Suez Canal revenues for Egypt, which is having a debilitating economic effect. It was causing insurance rates for commercial shipping to go up, causing a significant percentage of global shipping to take much longer and more expensive routes. Um, and there was always the risk that they hit a U.S. naval ship, at which point it sort of forced our hand in terms of some kind of a response. So it got to the point where it was just intolerable. But as we've seen in the ensuing months, both at the end of the Biden administration and the first few months of the Trump administration, easier said than done, right? The Houthis are enormously, I think, resourceful is the word that comes to mind. Yeah, they take support from the Iranians, but they don't consider themselves a proxy of the Iranians. They consider themselves um, their own Islamic government with their own policies and their own objectives. And they've shown a remarkable degree of resourcefulness in terms of weapons developments and resilience of their leadership. So easier said than done, but
Yeah,
I don't know that the ceasefire is going to solve it. Um, and I don't know, I can't guarantee you that simply escalated U.S. military strikes is going to solve it either.
right. We do have a question, and I'm curious, this kind of relates to the Houthi deal that doesn't include Israel, as well as the reports about a civilian nuclear program that will no longer include Israel. Are you seeing, or what's your best guess, what the Trump administration hopes to achieve in the Middle East and its broader strategy vis-a-vis this region? And particularly, it seems the question of pursuing American interests versus viewing the safeguarding of allies as part of that broader American interests. What is your best guess on where we are headed in terms of the Trump administration? I think we're hearing debates on, is the Trump administration actually engaging more in the region through Iran nuclear talks, through the first visit to the region, or is it actually disengaging by letting Israel essentially have a free hand in Gaza? No comments on developments in the West Bank and the like. What do you make of the administration's approach thus far?
Well, I'll go back to your term. I'm glad you used the phrase "my best guess" because that's kind of what I'm going to give you. One of the things, the overriding characteristics of the Trump administration is unpredictability. I think there's a fundamental tension that we've all seen, though, which is this is a fairly kind of inward looking, if not isolationist period for American foreign policy, born of, I think, Trump's own predilections, but also those of some of the folks in his political circle. Like,
Yeah,
not our problem. Don't get us roped into this. On the one hand, on the other hand, a set of partnerships and alliances and commitments that we've made, and a set of economic and security issues that we can't just ignore. And I don't know how that tension will be resolved. Um, it's interesting. Israel's a case where we would typically not hesitate to get involved. And here, Trump's not going to Israel on this trip. I think partly because he'd like to go at a time where there's something good to announce, where it looks successful. There's some positive dynamic going on, and right now it's pretty grim. Um, but also it's this general sense of not wanting to get roped into it. He has essentially his special envoy, his kind of Swiss Army knife of diplomacy, and Steve Witkoff, who's involved in Russia and Ukraine and Iran and the hostage ceasefire negotiations. So he may be a smart guy, but like he's only one person. And although you might say, oh, but he's sending somebody who's very close to him, I think that's probably a positive. On the other hand, he's just sending one person who may or may not have the requisite expertise in nuclear issues, for example. So I think that's symptomatic of this tension between not wanting to get involved in all and the sense that we, the United States, both because of what we represent, but also because of all of the relationships that we've developed and count on, can't just ignore it. And, he'll go to the Gulf next week and hear about and talk about all of the great economic opportunities that it represents, both countries that could buy US products and countries that can invest in job creating investments in the United States. That's great. But he'll also hear that their ability to do that is dependent in no small part on the stability of the region. And the stability of the region depends in no small part on how we play our hand.
Ambassador Ratney, I want to thank you for your time and insights. I feel like an hour flew by. I could ask you many more, and I want to apologize to the many questions we did not get to. I hope we can have you back sometime very soon.
With pleasure. It was great being with you. I hope that was useful for the participants as well.
Absolutely. We will have a recording of this conversation sent to you all and available online. Once again, I hope you will all be sure to be subscribed. And if you find Israel Policy Forum's resources of value, please consider joining us by making a contribution in support of our work online. Check out our latest podcast with Michael Milstein, which I think is really going to be an important discussion of what happens next in Gaza. And we will be in touch with you all soon about our next opportunity to connect by Zoom. Ambassador Ratney will be watching the news in the next few days and seeing what surprises we didn't predict, but appreciate your time and insights on it all.
All right. Thanks for the invitation, David.
Thanks a lot.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.